It sounds like a myth. But in the sweltering summer of 1944, as the world's greatest conflict raged across Europe and the Pacific, a quiet stretch of Florida coastline became the unlikely stage for one of the most extraordinary episodes of World War II. Here, under the relentless sun and the whispering palms, hundreds of captured German soldiers, men who had once fought for Hitler's Third Reich, were marched from their barbed wire compounds to the open shoreline. No sakles, no watechtovers looming overhead. Just the sound of the surf, the scent of salt in the air, and the distant gaze of a handful of American guards. Why did the U.S. military allow this? What did the Germans think as they gazed across the Atlantic, so far from home? And what happened when the locals saw their former enemies, not behind bars, but swimming freely in the waves? This is the forgotten story of Camp Blanding, Florida, the day German POWs were left alone by the ocean, and the moment that would test the boundaries of trust, humanity, and the very meaning of war. To understand how this remarkable day came to pass, we must first return to the spring of 1944. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Normandy. Across the Atlantic, the United States was not only fighting on distant fronts, but also managing the vast machinery of war at home. Factories churned out tanks and planes. Fields produced food for millions. And quietly, the U.S. Army was grappling with a new challenge: what to do with the tens of thousands of Axis prisoners now arriving on American soil. By May 1944, over 50,000 German POWs had been shipped to the United States. They were scattered across more than 500 camps, from the pine forests of the Midwest to the deserts of Texas. One of the largest was Camp Blanding, located just outside Stark, Florida. Originally built as a training base for the 31st Infantry Division, Blanding had been converted into a sprawling POW facility, housing nearly 2,000 German soldiers by the summer of 1944. Among them were men from the Afrika Korps, captured in Tunisia, U-boat sailors plucked from the Atlantic, and Luftwaffe pilots shot down over France. Their ranks included Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Müller, a 27-year-old tank commander from the 15th Panzer Division, and Feldwebel Hans Becker, a veteran machine gunner from the 21st Panzer. For these men, the war was over. But captivity in America was unlike anything they, or their captors, had expected. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment of prisoners. The U.S. Army, determined to set an example, provided decent food, medical care, and even opportunities for work and recreation. But the real surprise came in the form of trust. At Camp Blanding, the guards, mostly older men from the 325th Military Police Escort Guard Company, were few in number. The camp's barbed wire was more symbolic than secure. And as the Florida summer grew hotter, a new routine emerged: supervised trips to the nearby beach. By June 1944, the war in Europe was reaching a fever pitch. News of the D-Day landings filtered into the camp, carried by Red Cross bulletins and the guarded whispers of new arrivals. The German POWs, many of whom had not seen the ocean since their capture, grew restless. The Florida heat was oppressive. Tempers flared. Some men, like Oberleutnant Müller, spent hours staring at the horizon, wondering if they would ever see home again. It was during this tense period that Captain James L. Harper, the camp's American commandant, made a fateful decision. Recognizing the growing agitation among the prisoners and the risk of unrest, he proposed a radical solution: allow a group of POWs to visit the beach under minimal guard. The idea was simple: give the men a taste of freedom, and they would be less likely to rebel. On the morning of July 12, 1944, the plan was put into action. At 0800 hours, 200 German POWs were assembled in the camp's central yard. They wore simple khaki uniforms, each marked with a large white PW on the back. Their faces were a mix of suspicion and disbelief. The guards, just 6 men, armed only with sidearms, gave the order to march. The convoy moved slowly down State Road 16, past fields of palmetto and pine, until the shimmering blue of the Gulf appeared on the horizon. By 0930 hours, The group arrived at a secluded stretch of beach near Ponte Vedra. The sand was hot beneath their boots. The air was thick with humidity. For many, it was the first time they had seen the ocean since leaving Europe. The guards set up a small perimeter, but made no attempt to restrain the prisoners. "You are free to swim," Captain Harper announced. "But remember, this is America. We trust you." For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the Germans began to strip off their shirts and boots, wading into the surf. Some laughed. Others wept. Feldwebel Becker, the grizzled machine gunner, stood knee-deep in the water, staring out to sea. It was as if the war had vanished, he would later recall. For a few hours, we were just men again. But not everyone was at ease. Among the guards, Private First Class William H. Carter kept a close eye on the shoreline. He had heard rumors of escape attempts at other camps, men vanishing into the night, hoping to reach Mexico or Canada. Here, with only 6 guards and 200 prisoners, the odds seemed stacked against them. By 1100 hours, the beach was alive with activity. Some POWs played soccer with a makeshift ball. Others collected seashells, marveling at the strange, alien beauty of the Florida coast. A few, like Oberleutnant Muller, simply sat in the sand, lost in thought. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. What if someone tried to escape? What if the locals discovered who these men really were? At 1130 hours, a group of American teenagers appeared at the edge of the beach, their bicycles kicking up clouds of sand. They stopped, staring in disbelief at the scene before them. 200 German soldiers, laughing and swimming, watched by a handful of relaxed American guards. One of the boys, 16-year-old Tommy Jenkins, approached Private Carter. "Who are they?" he asked. Carter hesitated, then replied, "Prisoners of war. Germans." The news spread quickly. By noon, a small crowd of locals had gathered at the edge of the beach, watching the spectacle unfold. Some were curious. Others were angry. A few shouted insults in broken German. But the guards held their ground, insisting that the prisoners were under control. By 1300 hours, the mood had shifted. The sun was at its zenith, baking the sand and raising tempers. A group of local fishermen, led by 42-year-old Frank Delaney, confronted Captain Harper. "You're letting Nazis swim in our ocean?" Delaney demanded. Harper stood firm. "They're prisoners, not monsters. The war is over for them." But Delaney was unconvinced. "What if they escape? What if they hurt someone?" Harper replied, "They have nowhere to go, and they know it." Still, the tension was palpable. The guards tightened their perimeter. The POWs, sensing the change in atmosphere, grew quieter. Some retreated from the water, gathering in small groups along the shore. By 1400 hours, the first signs of trouble appeared. A handful of POWs, emboldened by the apparent lack of security, began to wander further down the beach. Private Carter radioed for backup, but the nearest reinforcements were miles away. For the next hour, the situation teetered on the edge of chaos. The guards watched nervously as the prisoners spread out, some venturing dangerously close to the dunes. The locals, now numbering nearly 50, grew restless. Shouts and jeers echoed across the sand. At 1500 hours, the crisis reached its peak. 2 POWs, Gefreiter Otto Schmidt and Unteroffizier Dieter Lang, broke away from the main group, disappearing into the tall grass beyond the dunes. Private Carter sounded the alarm. The guards scrambled to pursue, but the terrain was treacherous, the heat oppressive. For 20 agonizing minutes, the fate of the entire operation hung in the balance. If the escapees reached the nearby woods, they could vanish into the Florida wilderness. The locals, sensing the danger, began to panic. Some called the sheriff. Others demanded that the guards take more drastic action. Captain Harper faced an impossible choice. Should he order his men to open fire? Should he call off the beach visits altogether? The weight of command pressed down on him like the Florida sun. Meanwhile, the remaining POWs watched in silence. Some cheered for their comrades. Others, like Oberleutnant Muller, shook their heads in disbelief. "They are fools," he muttered. "There is nowhere to run." At 1520 hours, the guards finally caught up with Schmidt and Lang. Exhausted and dehydrated, the two men surrendered without a fight. They were marched back to the main group, their heads bowed in shame. But the damage was done. The trust that had defined the day was shattered. The locals, now openly hostile, demanded that the prisoners be returned to camp immediately. Captain Harper, his face drawn with fatigue, gave the order to assemble. The POWs, sensing the gravity of the moment, lined up in silence. The guards counted heads, 200, all accounted for. As the convoy prepared to depart, a sudden commotion erupted near the water's edge. Feldwebel Becker, the veteran machine gunner, had collapsed in the surf, overcome by heat and exhaustion. Private Carter rushed to his side, dragging the German to safety. For a moment, enemy and captor were united by a simple act of compassion. The march back to Camp Landing was somber. The POWs walked in silence, their earlier joy replaced by a sense of loss. The guards, too, were subdued. The experiment in trust had nearly ended in disaster. But what happened next would become legendary. That evening, as the sun set over the camp, Captain Harper gathered his men. He knew that the day's events would be scrutinized by his superiors. There would be questions, perhaps even accusations of negligence. But Harper also understood something deeper, the power of trust and the possibility of redemption. He called for Oberleutnant Muller and Feldwebel Becker, asking them to address their fellow prisoners. In the dim light of the barracks, Muller spoke with quiet authority. "We are soldiers," he said. "We have lost the war. But today, we were treated as men, not animals. We must honor that trust." Becker, still weak from his ordeal, added, "If we betray this, we betray ourselves." The message was clear. The next morning, the POWs assembled in perfect order. There were no escape attempts, no acts of defiance. Instead, the men volunteered for extra work details, helping to repair storm damage in the nearby town of Stark. They cleared debris, rebuilt fences, and even assisted local farmers with the harvest. Word of their conduct spread quickly. The townspeople, initially wary, began to see the Germans not as faceless enemies, but as individuals, men who had been swept up in a war they did not choose. By August 1944, the beach visits resumed, this time with stricter supervision, but also with a renewed sense of mutual respect. The POWs were allowed to swim, play soccer, and even organize concerts for the local community. For a few brief months, the boundaries between enemy and ally blurred. One day, a local newspaper reporter asked Captain Harper why he had taken such a risk. He replied, "Because war is not just about fighting. It's about what comes after. If we could show mercy, maybe we can build something better." The story of the German POWs who were left alone by the ocean did not end with the war. When the conflict finally ended in May 1945, most of the prisoners were repatriated to Germany. Some, like Oberleutnant Muller, returned to shattered cities and broken families. Others, like Feldwebel Becker, wrote letters to their American captors, expressing gratitude for the kindness they had received. Of the 200 men who visited the beach that day, none successfully escaped. The only casualties were minor: heat exhaustion, sunburn, and a few bruised egos. But the legacy of that day endured. In 1946, Captain Harper was awarded the Legion of Merit for his exceptional leadership and humane treatment of enemy prisoners. The town of Stark, once wary of the Germans in their midst, erected a small plaque near the beach, commemorating the Day of Trust. For the men of the 325th Military Police Escort Guard Company, the experience left a lasting impression. Private Carter, who had once feared the prisoners, later wrote, "I learned that even in war, there is room for decency. We were all just men, trying to survive." Today, the story of the German POWs in Florida is largely forgotten, a footnote in the vast history of World War II. But for those who lived it, the memory remains vivid. The sound of the waves, the heat of the sun, and the fragile, fleeting hope that even enemies can find common ground. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.